In the year 1499, millennial anxiety was rife. Strange portents in the skies seemed to herald the end of the world. In this feverish climate, northern and southern Europe were set on a catastrophic collision course. The Renaissance was about to enter its greatest crisis. The Renaissance is often thought of as the triumph of reason over superstition. But the truth is that it reached its climax in a world that was ablaze with religious fear and fervor. The millennial fears that troubled the Renaissance mind are encapsulated in the chapel of St. Brizio in Orvieto Cathedral. Begun in 1499, Luca Signorelli's panoramic frescoes were designed to put the fear of God into those who first saw them. They're based on the Book of Revelation, with its dread warnings of apocalypse and its vivid descriptions of hailstorms of blood. They certainly scare the hell out of me. The key to the whole chapel is a dramatic fresco of the preachings of the Antichrist. A deceptively Christ-like figure, he speaks the words which the devil is whispering into his ear. He is the false prophet, the beast with the number 666, who will beguile and deceive mankind. Inflamed by his words, his followers are energetically butchering true Christians. The backdrop to this bloody chaos made the scene's contemporary relevance unmistakable. The Renaissance cathedral being sacked and looted is a symbol of the church in Signorelli's day, the Church of Rome. It was a period when scholars and dissident monks were challenging the Pope's authority, both at home and abroad. The Church of Rome paid for these frescoes, and Antichrist may have stood for its many enemies. Those enemies were soon to be united under the leadership of Martin Luther. And as Christendom stood on the threshold of a holy war, these paintings were an attempt to rally believers behind the Pope. Their message to Orvieto was simple: don't follow false prophets, or hell and torment are waiting. In Northern Europe, people believed the route to salvation lay in a different direction. In growing cities like Nuremberg, a new invention, printing, was being used to promote radical new ideas and images. Cheaply available, mass-produced prints enhanced a growing German nationalism. Albrecht Dürer, the greatest artist of Renaissance Germany, published his own images of the terrors of apocalypse in the same year that Signorelli started his work, 1499. But how different Durer's vision seems. The four horsemen of the apocalypse have been caught almost as in a snapshot, crushing those beneath them. Unlike Signorelli, Durer doesn't seek to uphold the political status quo, but to relish the way death levels all. Kings and bishops shall die along with the rest of humanity. All mankind shall be judged alike. On the eve of papal Rome's rebirth as a great Renaissance city, Durer could have been predicting its downfall. For many centuries, Rome had been little more than a collection of ramshackle villages, dwarfed by the remains of antiquity. The great aqueducts built by the ancient Romans had fallen into disrepair, and the city had become an open sewer. The man who set out to restore Rome to its former glory was Pope Julius II, the second Julius Caesar, as admirers christened him, painted here by Raphael. The most dynamic of the Renaissance popes, this tough old man was to transform the capital of the Christian world. As if to prepare the city for God's final judgment, Julius began to rebuild the city on a scale not seen in Rome for more than 1,000 years. The church was on the brink of a crisis, yet the papacy was beginning to sponsor a hugely ambitious program of art and architecture, including the masterpieces of Raphael and Michelangelo. But perhaps it was the very grandeur of Roman Renaissance culture which led to its downfall and to a cataclysmic upheaval in Western civilization. In a sense, the prophets of doom were right. The end of the world was nigh. As proud Julius created a multitude of grand new buildings, Rome became the fiefdom of the most magnificent Renaissance prince of all. To seal his splendid reign, Julius planned his own tomb, a vast temple-like structure, which, he hoped, would be the eighth wonder of the world. Julius commissioned the young sculptor Michelangelo to make 40 classical statues of naked young men to adorn it. Few survive, but these two, now in the Louvre, still convey the project's daring and, to some, improper eroticism. Michelangelo's Moses dominates the tomb as it was eventually built, in a much scaled-down version, in Julius's original parish church, St. Peter in Chains. Isolated as it is, the statue still conveys the superhuman ambition behind the project. The scale of earlier Renaissance art has been vastly expanded. But there's something almost monstrous about this horned prophet, with his yard of flowing beard and his prominently veined arms furiously knotted with muscle. Sigmund Freud was fascinated by this statue's angry, scornful expression and said it made him feel like a heathen and a sinner. I think there is something almost terrifyingly inhumane about Michelangelo's great stone giant. And while the Moses might be a fitting monument to Pope Julius II, it's also a work which seems to encapsulate all the most unpleasant and megalomaniac aspects of his character. even Brunelleschi's famous Duomo in Florence would be topped by Julius's Millennium dome. It was to the dome of the Pantheon, built in the 2nd century AD, that the Pope's architect, Donato Bramante, looked for inspiration. Roman authors like Vitruvius had believed that temples should reflect the divinely ordained proportions of the human body. And because a man fits into a square and a circle, those shapes were held sacred. Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man revived this belief, in turn influencing Bramante. Bramante and his patron Julius were also inspired by the daunting scale of ancient Rome. Their imagination was fired by dreams of competing with the might of a long-dead empire. They wanted their own great temple to astound people for a millennium and more, just as the Pantheon had. Look on our works, ye mighty, and tremble. St. Peter's took more than 150 years to complete, but despite its many later Baroque additions, the stupendous scale of the basilica still epitomizes the grandeur and, in some people's eyes, the over-vaulting hubris of the Roman Renaissance. It's a church that seems almost like a great palace, making of the Pope and his cardinals a prince surrounded by all his court. I think St. Peter's is very much the building that Julius had hoped for. But what is difficult to appreciate in the basilica as it is today is the intellectual dimension of Bramante's original design. He'd meant St. Peter's to be a centrally planned church, as recorded in this medal. His intentions were never carried out, but a church in Todi, 50 miles from Rome, gives a strong indication of what it might have looked like. Santa Maria della Consolazione was built by one of Bramante's disciples, Cola da Caprarola. But it's still the fulfillment of Bramante's ideas, and it shows very clearly how he believed geometry could symbolize God. What's most striking about the inside is how stark and undecorated it remains. There are no windows at ground level, so the eye is swept upwards to the dome. This use of pattern and light alone was a radically unfamiliar and abstract way to convey the sense of God. The plan of a conventional church is the shape of a crucifix, a literal reminder of Christ's suffering on the cross. Instead, Bramante, the Pope's chief architect, used the circle to symbolize God's transcendent perfection. So while this is a very impressive building, it also reveals the Renaissance papacy's intellectual and rather remote brand of theology. The Roman Church had lost interest in the redemptive suffering of Christ's life here on earth, or so it seemed to many in Northern Europe, where they still held fast to a harsher and more nakedly emotive brand of piety. The papacy claimed dominion over all Christendom, but in truth the Pope paid scant attention to the needs of Christians in the cold north. In the absence of active spiritual leadership from Rome, Renaissance Germany had evolved its own, highly distinct religious culture. Created in 1515, this unforgettably vivid work was commissioned for the chapel of a leprosy hospital in Eisenheim in Alsace. Christ's agonized body has the symptoms of St. Anthony's fire, a fatal skin disease suffered by many of the patients at the hospice. Grunewald used complementary colors to play up the pathos of Christ's elongated body. Gangrenous green against the red of blood. Another crown of thorns is formed in sympathy by the hands of Mary Magdalene. The painting was meant to help the patients empathize with Christ too, to see their suffering as a chance to live by Christ's example and to show his fortitude. As the left-hand panel of St. Sebastian demonstrates, Grunewald was capable of painting anatomically accurate figures in the classical Italian manner. His distortions elsewhere were no sign of provincial ignorance, but a deliberate device to intensify emotional impact. The Eisenheim altarpiece is a work of many styles and many panels, each one unfolding a different layer of meaning and emotion. The onlooker empathizing with this brilliant image of the resurrected Christ, with his radiant, spotless skin, may have been consoled with the thought that one day his pain would stop and his body would be healed too. There is light at the end of the tunnel of human suffering. But perhaps the most striking image is the temptation of St. Anthony, a surreal depiction of the devil testing the saint's faith. A slumped figure with all the symptoms of St. Anthony's fire looks on, as if experiencing one of the hallucinations brought on by the disease. All around him, visions of disorder and anarchy swirl. The Eisenheim altarpiece is a work of almost incandescent imagination, but it doesn't leave me with an abiding sense of optimism about human destiny. I can't help wondering if this nightmarish vision was intended by Grunewald as some kind of commentary on his age. He's painted a world run mad. The idea that Europe was in deep spiritual peril was gathering momentum. Meanwhile, in the lofty world of Julius's Rome, having got his great basilica underway, the Pope turned his attention to transforming his own private apartments within the Vatican. Here he wanted to project not magnificence, but learning. He employed the 27-year-old Raphael to decorate his private library with an assembly of great men, past and present, engaged in spirited debate. The idea of such a pantheon was not in itself new. The Palace of Urbino, Raphael's hometown, contained a study lined with portraits of wise men. But here, it was brought to life. The School of Athens, for me, is the most optimistic and humane portrayal of civilization ever painted. Plato points upwards, towards the higher truth, while Aristotle's outstretched arm indicates that for him, true knowledge comes from this world. As Socrates holds forth, counting off philosophical points on his fingers, a member of his audience calls for pen and paper. A scribe rushes in. He personifies the tools of writing. His very cloak resembles a rolled-up document. Raphael's made the exchange of ideas into a drama, a scramble to preserve thought before it dies on the air. Human knowledge is a continuum, a conversation between different ages. Raphael has painted himself, looking out as the scholars muse and debate. There are jokes here too. Pythagoras is so wrapped up in his theorems that he doesn't notice the plagiarist copying his work. There are also several melancholic figures, including a portrait of the famously moody Michelangelo. As if to acknowledge that the intellectual life can also be lonely and troubled. Next to philosophy, Raphael depicted poetry, cleverly squeezing Mount Parnassus with Orpheus and other bards into a rather awkward shape over one of the library's windows. And next to that, he created a painting known as The Dispute on the Blessed Sacrament. This is the Christian complement to the progress of secular knowledge celebrated in the School of Athens. But for all its poise, it's got the disinfected smell of an official view. And in its own time, it was in fact a cover-up job. Pope Julius II had discouraged debate and suppressed church councils, insisting on his own frozen dogma. This vision of religious consensus was belied by reality. Dissent was being sown in the libraries of Northern Europe. The radical new Renaissance discipline known as philology, the scientific study of language, was quietly being developed by a Dutch humanist, Desiderio Erasmus. Applying it to the classical and Hebrew texts of Holy Writ, he set out to distinguish between the original, uncorrupted scriptures and later versions of the Bible as amended by the Church. He wanted to recover God's message in its utmost purity. As well as calling on people to discover God's word for themselves, Erasmus satirized the papacy with mordant wit. An aspect of his character captured by Hans Holbein. Just like Petrarch, the other great intellectual hero of the Renaissance, Erasmus became something of a cult. But whereas Petrarch, a century and a half earlier, had called for the rebirth of classical civilization, Erasmus called for the renaissance of Christianity. He turned humanist scholarship into a tool for revolution. The ideas of Erasmus spread rapidly in towns such as Nuremberg. Its wealthy merchants and bankers increasingly regarded the Pope as an absentee landlord. Living and working in the city, Albrecht Dürer was in many respects a kindred spirit to Erasmus. In 1500, he painted an almost disconcertingly intense self-portrait. He made himself look like a magus, a wise man, a German Leonardo da Vinci. But the painting is also permeated with a distinctively Northern European piety. Dürer's painted himself as a latter-day Christ, not purely out of arrogance, but as a reminder of man's duty to imitate the Lord, without any help from the established church. It was a message of which Erasmus would have approved. Dürer's print of 1514, St. Jerome in his study, could almost be a surrogate portrait of Erasmus toiling away. It shows St. Jerome accompanied by his traditional lion, working over his 4th century translation of the Bible. As if to show his fellow feeling for hard intellectual work, Dürer has filled the print with evidence of his own labour. His engraving is an astonishing catalogue of virtuoso effects, both in the depiction of objects and light. The scholar saint's head is haloed with light, a beautiful touch, making him, literally, an illuminatus. I think this print captures the absolute seriousness of Northern European intellectual life in Dürer's time. Whereas Raphael's cultural ideal was a brightly coloured, sociable exchange of ideas, Dürer's vision of learning is essentially solitary. An isolated scholar huddled over his book, intent on discovering truth through the word. The Protestant work ethic first stirred in early 16th century Germany. There was an aesthetic of work too, and it's exemplified by an altarpiece in Rottenburg ob der Taube, near Nuremberg, inside the Church of St. Jacob. Dürer's contemporary, Tilman Riemenschneider, spent 6 years creating what is, for me, one of the most breathtaking masterpieces of all Renaissance sculpture. Riemenschneider's Last Supper has retained the organic qualities of the limewood it's carved from. It looks as if it's grown and flourished into these shapes and figures, like some miraculous tree sprouting Christian images. Yet for its intricacy, the character of the work is sober and restrained. Pockmarked by woodworm, the faces have a solemn and pious character. The altarpiece is ungilded and unpainted. Flickering in its shadows, there's a pauperous disdain for mere show. The composition is unusual, for here it's Judas rather than Christ who occupies the central position. Riemenschneider designed it so that the sun shines through from behind, and as the day progresses, Judas is first spotlit and then cast into darkness. It illustrates the moment when Christ announces that one of you will betray me. Treachery and money love hand in hand. The subject is recognition of a traitor among the Christian brotherhood. A topical theme at a time when it was difficult to tell who was a true Christian and who was not. "3 years after Riemenschneider completed his altarpiece, the Caesar of Renaissance Rome, Pope Julius, asked Michelangelo to decorate the ceiling of the Vatican's largest chapel. Michelangelo always said that he regarded painting as an inferior art form, but I somehow doubt that he really meant it. And although he didn't enjoy painting the chapel's vast expanse, complaining that it gave him a sore neck and a beard full of paint, the impression is one of majestic effortlessness. Perhaps because he was still smarting from the cancellation of the great tomb for Julius, Michelangelo designed his decoration as a huge trompe-l'oeil architectural structure, supported by figures which look like statues. In a sense, the Sistine ceiling is the Julius tomb finally realized, not in stone, but in paint. He illustrated the book of Genesis, painting primal scenes such as the creation of the planets and the separation of land from water, rarely depicted in previous Christian art. God on the Sistine ceiling is creative energy incarnate, surging through space. He may also embody Michelangelo's sense of his own, almost superhuman capabilities. For while this is an image of God the artist, it's also an image of the artist as God, reaching out towards his finely sculpted creation, Adam, and imparting the spark of life. Like multiple reflections of Adam's divine beauty, Michelangelo has painted 20 male figures, stretching and posing on the borders of the biblical story. There was no precedent for this naked interruption. This chorus which seems to proclaim the beauty of art for art's sake. They're the boldest example of Michelangelo playing at being God, creating his own Adams, one after another, each a slightly different model. No one knows exactly what the nudes were meant to signify, I suspect they represent the struggles and aspirations of the human soul, a theme to which Michelangelo often returned in his religious poems. But many of his contemporaries were shocked by them and blind to their spiritual content. Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling was controversial in his own lifetime. Just 10 years after he'd finished it, Pope Hadrian VI contemptuously described it as a bathroom of nudes. I think it's impossible to overstress just how daring and original these frescoes were. In the eyes of many of his contemporaries, Michelangelo had reinvented Christian art to the point where its Christian message was almost being drowned out by the erotic and the aesthetic. During Julius's later years, the Papal States were invaded by Europe's first true superpowers, France and the Holy Roman Empire. Julius crushed the enemy, returning to Rome victorious. But, as if he sensed the imminent waning of papal power, his commissions took on an increasingly strident and propagandist tone. Julius promoted the myth of his own infallibility and omnipotence as never before. He commissioned Raphael to paint more frescoes in the Vatican, but this time on the themes of authority and military might. The expulsion of Heliodorus is an allegory of Julius's defense of the papacy and Italy against the invading French. There's a new restless energy about Raphael's style, influenced both by Michelangelo and by the ever more forceful demands of his patron. There's a straining for effect in the exaggerated contrast between a static pope and his convulsed foes. It almost prefigures the propaganda of Soviet socialist realism. Julius was growing old, and Raphael's radiant valediction to his patron is a depiction of the liberation of St. Peter from his chains, which Julius saw as another symbol of Italy's liberation from the French. Because of his links to the Church of St. Peter in chains, Julius identified with the imprisoned apostle, here freed by an angel of fire. Julius had celebrated his victory over the French with fireworks, and Raphael's painting is itself a pyrotechnic display of light effects. But while the artist was still at work, the Pope died, which gave another level of meaning to the image of Julius's alter ego, standing on the threshold of freedom. It became a vision of this most active Pope's release from the prison of mortal existence into the light of God. Not everyone had such a saintly image of Julius. Erasmus, in a scathing satire, imagined him bickering with St. Peter at Heaven's Gate. Julius said, "I'm one of the greatest popes who's ever lived. You'd agree if you'd seen all my soldiers, all my processions, all my great buildings, and all the splendid palaces lived in by my priests." But Peter replied, "You're no holy man. You're a tyrant and an enemy of Christ, obsessed by money and magnificence. If you're such a great builder, build your own paradise. You're not coming in here." Erasmus captured the clash of two Renaissance cultures. Displays which the papacy felt did honor to God, symbolizing his might and glory, were to the northern critics of Rome courtly, vain, materialistic. The funeral chapel of Agostino Chigi, chief papal banker, crystallizes all that had alienated Renaissance Rome from its enemies. Begun in 1513 and influenced by the splendor of Venetian mosaics, it's one of Raphael's most glittering creations. But Erasmus and his growing band of followers would have damned it. The wealth of the Pope and his bankers was, in any case, a touchy subject. To raise the money it needed, Rome had stepped up an infamous trade in indulgences, printed pieces of paper granting the buyer a papal pardon for his sin. The briskest trade was in wealthy German towns like Wittenberg, Saxony, where a disgruntled friar witnessed the marketing of indulgences and was outraged at what he saw. His name was Martin Luther. The Pope's agents hawked their instant remedies for guilty souls with shameless enthusiasm. Get your indulgences here, stop me and buy one, and even if you've slept with your own mother, your soul will be washed clean. Indulgences were even sold in advance, so that you could drop a coin in the box on the way to the brothel, knowing that you'd already bought God's pardon for the sins you were about to commit. As a response, Luther nailed 95 theses railing against Rome to the doors of Wittenberg's palace church. With the construction of St. Peter's, he wrote, the revenues of all Christendom are being sucked into that insatiable basilica. His call for reform became the issue of the day. The Reformation had begun. Luther brought about the revolution that Erasmus had seeded. He founded a new church for his fellow protesters, or Protestants. His friend, the artist Lucas Cranach the Elder, began to paint a new art for a new Christianity, a faith which returned to the purity of the Word. Cranach's altarpiece in St. Mary's in Wittenberg is a visual manifesto for the Reformed faith, fitting in a church where the sermons still have an apocalyptic, iconoclastic character.
Im heutigen Predigttext zeigen die Jünger Jesus stolz den Tempel. Er aber spricht zu ihnen: Seht ihr nicht das alles? Es wird hier nicht ein Stein auf dem anderen bleiben, der nicht zerbrochen werde.
In the Last Supper, Jesus and his disciples sit at a round table to emphasize the new democratic tenor of Lutheran teaching. All mankind forms a universal brotherhood, whatever the views of the Roman Church hierarchy. The apostles are portraits of Luther's allies in Wittenberg. Cranach's son hands Martin Luther the wine, while to his left is Hans Luft, the printer who disseminated Luther's teachings across Europe. Luther hated the intellectualism of Roman theology, believing God could only be reached through the heart, not the head.
Sagt Jesus. Bewahrt euch den wachen, kritischen Blick und die Orientierung an dem einen wahren Christus, dass das einzig sichtbare Zeichen Gottes in der Welt das Kreuz ist. Von falschen Propheten ist die Rede. Sie argumentieren wie der Versucher bei Jesus mit Bibelworten.
Luther also attacked the consolations offered by Catholic ritual. In Cranach's right-hand panel, an unrepentant sinner makes false confession, his bound hands symbolizing his real reluctance to change. On the left-hand side, Luther's right-hand man, the writer Philip Melanchthon, is performing a baptism rather than a priest. If you're close to God, you're better than any interfering cleric, particularly if you're guided by the Word. Cranach's painting may drone on a bit, like an overlong sermon, but it perfectly captures the spirit of the Lutheran Reformation. As Protestantism spread, Europe began to divide with a startling rapidity. At the back of the church, Cranach's son retells the biblical tale, The Lord's Vineyard, from a Lutheran perspective. On one side, Martin Luther leads his fellow Protestants, who nurture their crops industriously. On the other side, the Pope and his bishops rip up the crops, while friars pour stones down the well. When the money-grubbing Pope and his luxurious retinue ask Jesus for their wages, he says that all he'll give is a penny. There's something wonderfully neat about this view of Europe as a world split between fat cat, no-good Catholics and perfectly virtuous Protestants. But Christendom hadn't simply been divided in two, it had been shattered. Many forms of dissent sprang up, some extremely violent, as reflected in popular prints. Monks were literally seen as instruments of the devil. The Reformation seemed like a fulfillment of the prophecies of Revelation. The hysteria of 1499 was rekindled, but now people believed that the final conflict had actually begun. While Durer and Signorelli had depicted the terrifying creatures of apocalypse as mythical demons, now they became real people. In this Protestant print, the whore of Babylon is the Pope. As the flames of Reformation burned, Julius's successor, Leo X, fiddled. God has given us the papacy, so let us enjoy it, he said, embarking on a great spending spree. The fire in the Borgo, painted for him by Raphael in his workshop, was meant to emphasize Leo's invulnerability, yet it has a curiously hedonistic air. Its theme was the miraculous extinction of a raging fire by an earlier pope, here played by Leo. He's an oddly small and unconvincing figure. It's hard to believe that the fire will indeed go out. There's more emphasis on the foreground panic than on the papal miracle. There's a perverse sensuality at work here. It's as if Raphael had lost faith in the political purpose of the work. The fire in the Borgo is an almost hysterical picture, which seems to evoke the weakness of the papacy in the years after Julius's death, when a succession of rather ineffectual popes ruled. This image of an effete and decadent Rome, unable to withstand the forces of destruction, turned out to be prophetic. In 1527, Rome was sacked by troops of the Holy Roman Empire, including 10,000 German Lutherans. They broke into the Vatican, looting and pillaging. Raphael's fresco of harmonious religious debate was vandalized, the name Luther scratched into it. That knife may have been put to other uses. Monks and nuns were singled out for torture and rape. Nearly half the population was killed. It's said there was a deathly hush in Rome after the sack. It was as if the apocalypse had indeed come to pass. In time, the Catholic Church would begin to reform itself, and the artist whose work most solemnly anticipated this shift was, appropriately enough, Michelangelo. His last paintings are in the little-known Pauline Chapel, the Pope's own place of prayer in the Vatican. On a barren hillside, a crowd has gathered to witness the martyrdom of St. Peter, the first pope and symbol of the papacy. To avoid comparisons with Christ, Peter, in his humility, had been crucified upside down. All the other figures are ghosts. The soldiers who arrive in an irrelevant clamour epitomise the irrelevance of human history itself. A busy but pointless march of mundane events across the field of the world. The grim face of Peter insistently draws the eye back to it, nailing you to the spot as surely as the saint's body is nailed to the cross. It feels like coming face to face with Michelangelo himself. To me, this looks less like an affirmation of papal authority than a stern reminder of the Pope's responsibilities. After all, Michelangelo had witnessed the foibles and frailties of the popes at first hand for more than 40 years. It's as if the fiery, devout old artist was spelling out a message to them all. A true pope lives not in pursuit of worldly glory or sensual pleasure. Instead, he lives by the example of St. Peter's own sacrifice. Michelangelo's parting shot, the conversion of Saul, could almost have been commissioned by Martin Luther himself. He's painted the moment when God sent down a bolt of light to stun Saul. A man who can only see when he is blind, no longer dazzled by the eye. The painting is heavy and awkward, a rejection of beauty, almost a rejection of art itself. Michelangelo wrote these lines of verse. Now I know well it was a fantasy that made me think art could be turned into an idol or a king. Though all men do this, they do it half unwillingly. Painting and sculpture cannot anymore quieten the soul that turns to God again. To God, who on the cross for us was set. In Northern Europe, artists did not have to turn on their own earlier work. It was done for them. One strain of Protestant thought came to hold that religious images got in the way of man's direct relationship with God, and huge quantities of religious art was burned and smashed. But as if to compensate, secular genres like northern landscape painting flourished, culminating in the mid-16th century works of Peter Bruegel. Undeceived, panoramic images of the way life is. Emblems of a new, post-Reformation world. Across the divide separating Protestant and Catholic, there was a recognition among the leading minds of the period that the very fabric of Europe had changed. The only thing that is certain is that nothing is certain. That was the stoical maxim adopted by the great spokesman of the age, the French author Montaigne. But this new intellectual skepticism was also a new form of open-mindedness. The post-Reformation world may have been a less comfortable place, but its horizons were broader.
Renaissance continues next week with a look at the contribution made by the Venetian Republic. But stay with us now as Compass looks at the state of Freemasonry in Australia.